We're talking about generations in the wild, understanding what drives environmental values across age groups. We have Amy Hayes with us, who will be introduced shortly. Most of you have probably already seen this question. This will be your last chance to throw an answer into the chat. This will be your last chance to throw your answer into the chat. I don't know why it keeps moving without me clicking it. For this question, but do different generations experience connection to nature differently? And then your response can be yes, significantly, yes, somewhat, not much, or not at all. So if you haven't answered that yet, go ahead and drop that in the chat while we go over some of the general housekeeping. The first one, of course, is our standard slide for the meeting room etiquette. If you're having any experiencing any issues with WebEx, you can use that link. It's also on our TMN Tuesday page using that QR code in order to get to that help guide. The chat function, as you can probably tell, is open for discussion. Please be professional and respectful. And when you're asking questions throughout the webinar, please be conscious of your spelling and grammar so that at the end, when we present those questions to Amy, that we can get your point across as effectively as possible. This session will go for 1 hour and will count for an hour of advanced training. The recording from today will be posted on our TMN Tuesday page either later this afternoon, if not then by tomorrow morning. And so you can watch that if you have to bow early or if you've missed anything. And just a reminder, you aren't able to unmute. That's by design. So any questions that you have, drop those in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Also, if you have some time, please fill out this survey to help support events like this. And you can either use the link I just put in the chat or the QR code there. It's completely voluntary. For location, just put where you are viewing from, and it helps support us continuing events like this in the future. Some more exciting events coming up is our April TMN Tuesday is going to be our virtual volunteer fair. We have closed the proposal collection period and are currently reviewing those. So the time is still to be announced, but go ahead if you're wanting to mark a certain range on your calendar, go ahead and just mark from 11 to 2 for that day. That's not the set time at this time, but that's just giving you kind of a window, a ballpark to plan for. You can find more information using that QR code or on our TMN2, well, actually on a blog post on our Naturalist News page. One of the, Michelle or Mary Pearl can drop that into the chat. But yeah, just save the date for April 14th. And then another note on upcoming TMN Tuesdays is you may have noticed if you have already registered for May that the time changed. That was intentional. Our speaker that we have for May needed to kind of bump up the time, so we're doing that one from 11:30 to 12:30. More specific information on who it is and the exact topic will come out a little bit later, of course. But to give you a bit of a hint, it will cover grant writing, which will be very beneficial for anyone looking to apply for the 2026 Pollinators for Texas initiative, which more information for that will be coming out in the coming months. But just get excited for that. If you aren't registered yet, use that QR code on our TMN Tuesday page to get registered for that. And just make a note of the time change, 11:30 to 12:30, which again, if you can't make that new time change, it will be recorded and added to our website. And with that, I'll let Michelle introduce Amy.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick overview and then turn it back over to you, Hannah. So today's speaker is no stranger to the Master Naturalist program. Amy Hayes is a dear friend of ours. If you were at the annual meeting this year, you saw Amy present a few different topics for us, a wealth of knowledge. And I mentioned she's no stranger to the Master Naturalist program, was actually shared an office with me as I began my journey with the Master Naturalist program almost 28 years ago now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to do the rest of the introduction.
As you can see from the slide, Amy is the founder and principal consultant for Science Sake. And if you attended our last annual meeting, you might have seen that she had a session there, and we had a lot of great feedback from that session. So we were very excited to have her join us today for this TMN Tuesday. And I've heard she's added a few things, I believe, to that. So if you did attend that, there'll be some new information as well. So Amy, welcome, and we're excited to hear from you.
You. Thank you so much. All right. Well, I am excited to be here, and I'm excited to be here with all the Master Naturalists. Michelle, I think it was only 10 years ago. That was it. 10 years ago. It wasn't in the
Yes,
last century.
age-wise, it was just 10 years ago.
Exactly. I'm going to share my screen, so give me a second to push that up, and we'll go ahead and get that started. Let's see. And then if you'll just let me know how that looks on your side when it comes up. Oop.
It looks good. We've got the full slide.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the introduction. And I was at the annual meeting and we talked about generations. I did add some content because it's really different when you talk about it in a webinar. We have a chance a little bit to look at more information, but we don't get the chance to get the feedback. So I added some information that I thought might be helpful to this particular audience and being able to act upon those potential differences. And there was a question at the beginning about generational intelligence. And do you think that people approach nature differently depending on where they are in the different generations? And so we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive in that. And there's no right or wrong answer. And it could be even the way that you interpret the word differently. It could come from ways that they grow up, but I want to give you some background maybe about how people might see themselves as land stewards. They might see themselves as environmental stewards. They might act upon that. And if you're in a chapter, you might be asking yourself, I'd love to see a lot of different generations joining. Or if you work an outreach or any different ways of interpreting nature to different people, I'm hoping that you'll find a little tidbit of information in here that might help you in your everyday job. So that's my hope today. What are we looking at really is that we are really talking about generational intelligence from the way that I look and research, and is that we are both working in an environment where we are probably working with people, whether you're retired, whether you're on a volunteer basis, whether you're in the workplace, or whether you're actually creating information or outreach or programming, you're actually having to think about something that's a little bit complex. We haven't seen as much of this in the past as we're seeing now, but there are 5 generations that are working together. There are 5 generations that own land. Our generational number of generations that we have right now is rather large. Typically, you have 4 generations, and I'm going to give you just a tad of information about what defines a generation, and you'll understand it's not exactly mathematical, but it is about the way people grow up. There's a different and significant difference in some of the things that they value, and that makes us respond to different environmental cues. And then as we're watching that unfold from the side of watching that in science and looking at some ways that people interpret even words like nature or words like environment, we find out that the internal way they react to those things and also the way they act on those things, their ethos can be a little bit different. So I'm going to try to describe those changes and why we see them. They're not right or wrong. There's not one generation that's greatest at that and one generation that's terrible at that, although we tend to kind of sometimes think in that way. It's really about what motivates and shapes them and shapes some of their decision making and views. So we're going to go over that some. And just out of curiosity, while we're going through this, so I'm going to leave this up for a minute. But many of us, and even in that question that you answered, is this a significant issue? In the chat, just go ahead and answer this little piece for yourself. What most shaped your personal connection to nature? And type as many things in the chat that are meaningful. And I'm going to start with an example so that you can understand the things that might shape. When I was growing up, I was in a time frame where two really, I guess they would be popular things that were going on was the Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom. So those of you that are in share my generation, you might remember that on TV. And then I was really exposed to scientists through television, like Jacques Cousteau. And so for me, when I was starting out and young, the things that really exposed me to those were one, things that I saw that was on media, and those media those days was TV. And then my family was very involved in hiking clubs. So when I was a youngster, we would go hiking as a group, and almost every weekend, my family would go out with a group of people in Colorado and we'd hike. So I had some pretty high exposures to things that would shape my feelings toward the environment, toward my role in nature, and to some of the things that I valued. And those happened to be one through that experience in media. And then I had this lived experience as well, being exposed through actual hiking and outdoor encounters. So that's a kind of thing that I think when I look back and I say, gosh, that really influenced me. That's where the places where I can actually recall falling in love with nature or getting excited about that. So if you have a chance, just pop that in the chat and we'll take a look at those as we go on. But it's really interesting to see where people have their first encounter. So want to make right away, it's really important to realize that when we talk about generational intelligence, I'm going to use the namings that we call different generations. And right away, somebody's going to say, you really shouldn't put people into a box. And that's true. You shouldn't. We have to be really aware of bias and stereotypes. When we look at this and we look at people, these are generalities that we tend to see around generations. And they're not good or bad. They're just things, the tendencies that we notice. So I'm going to talk about generations by their generational naming. And I may do a little bit of shaming for each generation. It's true. We all have our strengths and our weaknesses. But what's key is that these are not always things. And they're also shouldn't be used to create some bias and stereotypes, even though that's our favorite thing to do. That's probably my favorite thing to do as well, just to be really just kind of mindful of those as we go. And so I like to say that we look at generations and we can kind of figure out in some fun ways the ways that we're all different. One of the things I love to say is that if you have a favorite on this list, then you probably can identify with one generation or another. So this is how a kind of fun way to look at the fact that we do share some interesting differences and different influences. And you will notice that one of these is split in the middle, and there's a reason for that. This particular generation cannot commit to one or the other. And so I get a lot of grief if I try to put them in one side or another. As we go in generations, things change all the time. And we notice that due to quite a few things. And technology is a pretty big driver of this. So we'll talk a little bit about that. If you're wondering which generation you might be, and you can kind of take a look at this, and I'm going to describe what makes a generation as well, this is the way that generations are broken down today into different class areas. So we have the silent generation, which is a generation that for the most part is the generation that is getting smaller. And then Gen Alpha is the newest generation on the scene, with many of them born just last year. So one thing that people really notice right away is that generations, when I first started out studying generations, I thought, oh, okay, there's a specific time frame, let's say 25 years, and every generation is born. That's not necessarily the case here. If you look at the numbers, you'll see that they're not perfect numbers. There's not 4 generations in a century, which is why right now we're experiencing 5 generations that are living together, because some generations seem to span a lot of years and some generations seem to span very few. If you'll look at Gen X, you'll see that they span 15 years, whereas you can see a little bit in some of the other generation, they're closer to 20 and 25 years. So there's a science to this, actually, and the science of generational intelligence is something that people study. And when they look at a generation, what really defines that is that this is a generation, is a really typically named a birth cohort. And those are people who are born during a similar time span, and they are shaped by formative conditions. So most of our shaping, how we respond to the world, is shaped in the first 25 years of our life. And that's pretty similar between everybody. And those tend to be around major events that are going on, major economic cycles, technologies that are available, some cultural norms, and things that kind of influence us. So they look at a people, and they are able to actually do through studies by looking and saying, how do you feel about something? And it's usually this group of people, this birth cohort, they tend to share some things that are very similar. That you can think about that as one of our birth cohorts, right? Some of us would have been born where our experience to technology, let's say television, would have been very different. Some people were born where television was just coming onto the scene. For their fundamental years, it wasn't even available. So where they received information, where they perceived the world, some of the ways that they got a view into the world was not through the same way that somebody who would have been born where television, let's say, was part of their day, where they learned to watch the news, which, as we go farther, well, now we have generations that don't watch TV at all because they stream things. So they don't watch television in the same manner. Same way can be economic cycles, can be ways that we have different times where we have war and peace. And then a parenting. So who brings you up? Some generations are brought up by a full family grouping of people. Some generations are brought up more dominantly, like in mine, by potentially single parents. And it varies. So the way that we look at that in the first 25 years of your life, well, that has an interesting impact on what you see and how you watch things evolve. So that can be times where people in different generations will build or withhold trust or have relationships in different ways. They may assess risk and uncertainty in very different ways. Some can be born during a lot of time when there's a lot of uncertainty. And so they may look to institutions to give them certainty, or economics to give them certainty. Different generations actually relate to authority and institutions differently, and they communicate and make decisions very differently. You can imagine, if I ask some people, would you rather have an in-person visit? Would you rather have a text? Would you rather have a phone call? Would you rather have an email? We'll find that different people prefer different things, and actually it can be kind of offensive on the other side when they're not given communication in a way that they think is the norm for the way they should. It causes a lot of havoc. In the workplace, it causes a lot of havoc. It also causes some interesting havoc on creating programs where we want multiple generations there, but maybe we're using a different way to communicate to them than they actually want to be responded to. For our sake, for the environmental side or the stewardship side, we're going to look at that into how do they see themselves as responsible to the environment, maybe the ways that they actually view stewardship, and how's that changed over time. We want to take a little bit deeper dive into that. So as we go through these, we're looking, and scientists are looking for keys about how different generations might respond to different major significant issues. And climate and environment and nature are one of those major things that generations actually feel quite differently about across their tendencies. So I want to just make sure that we understand that when we look at generational intelligence, it's really a lens into which we can see people and not a type. I think we really want to be careful about saying that, well, one generation feels absolutely this way because they are this way. It's just a lens to understand, okay, what may be good triggers for them to respond with us, what may be ways to create great programs, what may be really good ways to reach them on different media sources. It's not a personality type. It's not a fixed trait. It's just a lens into which we can kind of deeply dive into how widely varied they are and how we can just be a little bit more successful in programming. I want to share really quickly some just kind of just let you know that even they've been polling in the Gallup polls for years and years and years. When they took this segment into looking at generations, they found the same thing, that people actually have different strengths in each generation. And I thought it was really fascinating to kind of look at this, because this does have implications too when we look at the environmental side or the natural resource side, stewardship side. Do people feel like they have a responsibility toward thing? Do they have empathy? How much are they looking for ways to use nature to do something else? And so this, we're not going to look at this too closely today in terms of this particular study. But if you're thinking, well, has anybody really looked at this very deeply? There are many, many places that are looking at the way generations react to their world by the lens of generational intelligence. So I just wanted to share that with you, because lots of people always ask, like, who is looking at this deeply? So let's just dive into that. And I mentioned that generations, these cohorts, they share some commonality between them. And that is that when you're growing up, the way that you look at the world is a generation starts with a generation coming through something that's tragic, and they look at how generations tend to problem solve. So we're going to look at the tragedies and strengths of each generation, and you'll get a feel for these. I'll describe them, but that's how a new generation starts, is this cycle restarts. That's why that's not every 25 years. It's not about being born and then you mature by 25. It's a cyclic system that drives generations. So the years tend to tighten up as a generation goes through 25 years. So there is a little bit of shift sometimes with the actual years that people are in a generation, because the cycling is completing, and we'll talk about each of those. So I want to just tell you that there is a lot of ways that generations differ. And this particular slide is one that I get requested the most of, is that it really shows that as they're looking through, and as the scientists are looking through, okay, do they really have that significant of style? And here are 13 things I tend to look at and test generations across, and they try to figure out, are they really that different from each other? And when they continuously see a significant amount of differences. And so this particular one I keep by me, and when I'm developing programming, when I'm creating messaging, when I'm meeting with people, I try to understand, okay, are they going to have a format of learning that might be different? And if I'm creating something that's a learning event or a training event, I use this to help me understand what's ways that different generations may be needed to be served. And if there's things on here that I don't know what they mean, I go and find out, what does that generation typically tend to have a likeness for. You like what is mostly in your generation. So it's really hard for us to imagine that people could interpret the world or have a different way of learning or have a different way of problem solving and making a decision that's different from the way that you do, because you have the tendency to like what you grew up understanding. That could have been in school, you were taught to problem solve that way. It could have been during your lifetime, you watched your parents, you watched society solve things in different ways. So we have to kind of get outside of our own generational preferences. I use this also to help me say, don't do things all the time the way that you like. If I say, well, I think people need mentors, Well, guess what? Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they need a coach. Some generations need a partner. May need somebody to role play with them. So when I'm designing things, I actually sometimes go back and I tell myself, don't get stuck in the way that you have preferences to. If your job is to work with others, which most of our job is, it helps me understand that when people are saying, "Hey, would you mind presenting that in a different way, or would you mind or if I see people tuning out or not showing up, I can sometimes say, okay, maybe it's the way that I've set up for their learning style. And I use this chart pretty frequently. So one question is, when they start to look at this thing, our internal conservation ethos, and this, keep in mind, this is in the United States, so I'm not saying that this is all over the globe, people feel the same way. But even a simple question about this came out from Pew, and Pew Research asks people across the United States all the time what kind of ways are about all kinds of different situations. This particular one was asked about climate change in 2021. And they were interested just in seeing, okay, do different generations actually answer the question differently about it being a priority? So all this really shows is, yes, there are differences. Are they super significant to this particular question? It might be significant about whether or not they are if they feel like, yep, there's absolutely something that needs to be addressed. Have they talked about it or taken action? Well, there is a difference among generations about something even as small as this particular question was about, have they taken action on climate change on or offline? And so, yeah, there is a difference, and we see it in generations when it begins to breaking down. So we asked that question at the beginning, do you think that maybe there's different ways that generations approach their role in nature? And is it influenced significantly by generations? And the sounds is that, yes, there is a differences in our generations and how they think about themselves in nature, how they approach themselves and problem solving some of our environmental problems. So that's kind of interesting. So I'm going to tell you about those differences. And these are doorways that I want you to think of them as doorways that people use to relate to environmental issues today. On the whole, this is kind of a large overscope. I'm not saying that you do in your particular generation, but on the whole, this is what we're finding about how people feel about the environment or nature or their role as stewards. So when I do use this in my work, I use these as frameworks to test a little bit to see where are we in the conversation. So if I meet with a group, I work a lot with farmers and ranchers. I work a lot with groups that are in a conservation, and we work as a whole with people. I try to use some of these things to understand if we're trying to work out an environmental solution, or I'm trying to entice them with a program, what might be an attractive way to do that. So I'm using it as a doorway to listen a lot to what they might like to see or do or hear. And my job is really to see what's active, what's going well, where can we make inroads, versus where I don't want to pick apart people, but I do need to know where are going to be some stop signs that, hey, we don't want to go down this road, or this is not going to be an effective way for us to start a program, or maybe I have some social media I need to put out. Or even if I'm working with people on things, something like a land trust, where I'm trying to figure out with a family, what's the best way that we might approach this so that your needs are met. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and I like to think of them as doorways. So this generation is important to understand, even though they're getting to be a smaller generation. This is a generation who is moving forward into ending their generational time. And so we call them this traditional or silent generation. And they are a very practical generation. Now, think about this generation helps set up a lot of the systems that we still have today in the United States and natural resources. This is the group of people who would have been setting up all the agencies that we're familiar with that work with the public and natural resources, and the start of a lot of our programs. So a lot of the things that they experienced and the systems that they set up are still going on today, and it happens to frame a lot of the things that we have. It also explains a lot why sometimes the new generations are like, well, we don't quite see our role in nature as doing the same thing. So I'm just going to talk about them for a moment because it's important to understand what was going on when they were doing their growing up and what was framing them, as well as the second slide that I'll show after each generation is how they feel about the environment and what their interactions maybe was that during that growing up time. This is a generation that experienced an extreme amount of war, both for themselves and their parents, back-to-back world wars. They are a very disciplined type of generation because the way that they moved through the tragedy, so these are tragedies of war and the Great Depression, was to get very disciplined in the type of things that they did. They put their heads together. They were very loyal in the workforce, so that they could solve those very difficult problems. So many of the ways that they had of setting up systems and their approach to the environment was very practical and very prescription. So they had a set number of ways that they did things, and everybody did them the same way to achieve great outcomes. So if we look at how that happened in the environment, well, this is also the era of the CCC. And ways that we moved through that was that people worked in the environment. And this is when a lot of if you ever go to some of our state or national parks, you'll see amazing works done by this particular generation because they were very practical, they were very loyal, and they did things the same way. So when we work with this generation, the motivation toward them and their environmental ethos is that they do what others did. So they do things as a group. So we see a lot of our original programming to this is very classroom style, is very group oriented. And a lot of these people are attracted by being part of a group of people doing great things. So it was a very good generation that the way that they approached things was large numbers of people did the same thing together. Now that was really good, but it also had a difficulty as things move forward when the way that we categorize whether things were a success was a large number of people doing the same thing. So for those of us who have been in a reporting type of system in organizations or agencies, the number of people doing things seems to be really important. There was not really necessarily a counting of whether it was super effective. This generation was extraordinarily hardworking. We know that the things that they did were super effective because they're still around. However, a lot of people don't operate in this way anymore. So some of it can be a mismatch in terms of what we saw moving through the environment is everybody doing the same thing. On the flip side of that, we had a little bit of problems with this. This is the time frame into which we also had the moving on in industry of all of us doing the same thing, including industrial farming and some other things that turned out to be not so great because we did them in mass all the time together. So that's changed over time, and it has had its goods and its bads and its environmental ups and downs. But for this particular generation, that is a major source of how they achieved things as they did large environmental projects together, expanding of parks, expanding of our system. And that has carried over to many generations. The next generation on the scene was during a time we had another great, as you can imagine, this generation, when I talk about tragedies, well, their tragedies shifted. This tragedy is we had two great leaders assassinated. It was during a time of massive civil rights. It was a time of great things like civil rights emerging, things that were innovative, like landing on the moon. Our view of the world was significantly changing and expanding. So we see this generation have a very, very different viewpoint than the generation before them. The generation before them approached things very pragmatically. This generation approaches things, all things are possible, with lots of optimism. So, in terms of what happened in our natural environment with this generation, well, there's a large expansion of the possibilities of things that could be done. There was a lot of experimentation, there was a lot of innovation, and we see the rising of the personal computer in this generation. So, these things influence the way that there was a view of the environment. And that is also on that side of it, the rise of environmental law. So we now have a time where actually they want to do the right thing. And so we see the majority of environmental law being created by people of this generation that says when you need to do something right, you create the context of law around it and you implement it so that people can tell what's right and what's wrong. And so this is the way that problem solving was reached for this generation. So we can see that playing out even today when somebody says, well, how do you solve great environmental problems? Some people say of this generation would say, well, you pass more laws to do that. Other generations may not feel that way. That's not how their generation rose up, but this particular generation does have a very optimistic outlook, and they are concerned about doing what's right. So when you talk to them or we create programming, a lot of times we say, you know what I need to do, or what I personally need to do is explain, okay, here's the systematic way things are that make this the right thing to choose. So that is a trigger for this generation. And they ask me a lot of times, well, is that, how do we know that's right? And so it's a very interesting way that we went from a group of people that said, I need to know the prescription of how to do things. This one wants to know what makes this particular thing right or wrong. We can see this a lot when we see some tension in the climate issue. Is there's a lot of people who will actually say that the word right and wrong. And so we see that happening a lot in different ways that we look at the environment. So I want to just talk to you just after each generation now, because these are generations that you're working with, about what they might have a view toward. This particular generation, as far as stewardship, views their roles in tradition and legacy. They prioritize hard work, loyalty, and face-to-face relationships. So this is what they're looking for when they're want to work with people. They are prioritizing those things. They want to work hard. They believe in loyalty. Face-to-face relationships are really important to them. If you're from another generation than this generation, I'm not from this generation, I look at that and see, okay, when I talk to them, we talk about, tell me about your tradition. What kind of legacy do you think you want on the land? When I work with a group of people, I might ask them in this particular generation, is there something that you think that you want to do that would be significant, that you want to be known for? What's your legacy that you like to work with? I also prioritize face-to-face meetings with them. If I'm working with people in this group or a person in this group, I might know that they would prefer that type of relationship over others. I can ask them and say, would you prefer that? Would you prefer that we meet? Or would you prefer that I text or call you? How important is a relationship with me personally versus a relationship with my team? Some of those strategies I use for outreach is I do tend to find out what has been your experience, and let's try to incorporate those. If we're trying to change things, I need to figure out how does that experience play into what we're moving toward. I highlight how some of the new things that we're proposing, if we're changing programs, both honor those past traditions and promote some progress. So I try to find a way to create those bridges. That's pretty important when working with these groups. The Generation X, this is one of our smaller generations, and they tend to run through, they were born between 65 and somewhere in the 80s. This generation is not, most people would tell you this generation is not a fun generation to work with, that they're mostly jerks about everything. They're very skeptical. And so they don't really believe they don't believe a lot of the things that you want to bring to them without data to interpret that. And that's because when they were growing up and forming things, they were receiving information mostly through a lot of data. This is a generation is growing up with computers being more prevalent. And when you needed to look something up, you weren't going to an Encyclopedia Britannica anymore. You were taught to look it up on the computer. The problem, however, is that information wasn't aggregated very well. So they are very skeptical about information that they can't research themselves. They are also during an era where there was a lot of things that seemed to not be going right. And this always happens with a group of people that are born at the end of a century. There was a lot of conversation about the fact that the century was going to end. Nothing would be going right, including any of the environment. People would be experiencing a full level of nuclear war. Everything was toxic. There was chemicals all over the place, and there just wasn't really a lot of hope for moving forward. Unfortunately, because they also were exposed to information through multiple media sources, it was right there in front of them all the time. So this particular generation has a high need of whatever programming you're doing or working with them. They need you to prove it. Prove it's going to be worth their time. They have a limited amount of time. They're a relatively small generation, and they want you to prove it. So what they're going to be looking at when you work with them is what kind of data shows that. So a couple of our generations, they really don't want to deal with the data. They aren't comfortable with data. They don't think people need data. This particular generation may or might not move off center without data that helps them interpret the world. Their lens, a lot of times, is through data. If you ask them, and maybe some of you here are this generation, you probably, whenever I say something, in your mind, you're saying, like, I hope you have the data to back that up. That's what we hear a lot in this generation. So the way that we work with them in the practical ways is they're very independent, pragmatic, and focused on balancing their work and personal life because they're a relatively small generation with a lot of responsibilities, not only for their kids, but they are also called a sandwich generation. They also have a lot of responsibilities with their parents. So they have it in both sides. So they value efficiency. We hear a lot of pushback because this generation doesn't show up to meetings, which boomers love to have. This generation is pretty independent. They don't have a lot of time to spend in those types of ways. So they want you to give them the information. They want the information not to be present only when they show up. Many people signed up for this webinar just to get the recording later on, and they're probably from this generation. They're going to watch it on their own time. They want the information on their own timing. They want to know where to go to find that information. So strategically, they want practical benefits of why they should spend their time with you. So a lot of times we need to provide data-driven insights. If I'm working on a program that says, hey, why do I want to put together a water conservation program? Well, this generation will ask me exactly how many minutes do I need to spend here to save a gallon? How many acres do I need to plant to do this particular thing? They want very efficient without it creating a lot of complexity in their lives. So if you have a program that's going to take 10 steps to certify them, probably not going to be in part of your program, especially if it's not very flexible to allow them to complete that. Millennials is the generation that everybody gives a lot of grief to. They call them all kinds of things, and they say, well, they're just overrunning everything. However, this particular generation is extraordinarily resilient and extraordinarily hopeful. And in terms of actually being part of the solution for natural resources, this is the first generation that actually looks at things and asks and responds to global signals. So one of our favorite kinds of quotes is, conservation stops where the first raindrop falls. And this particular generation completely usually understands that in the environment is a global question. Moisture in North America, or moisture in the Sahara, or dust from the Sahara, or practices that are done across the globe, or species diversity as a whole, they actually can mentally do more than the generations before them in threading that story together. So sometimes when I work with this generation, they ask me, well, what's the best thing that we can do? And when they're talking about best, they're talking about best on a global scale. And that's kind of exciting for the environment and stewardship moving forward, because a lot of the impacts that we're talking about do have impact more than just our local area. Now, it's difficult sometimes for this generation and generations before them to have conversations around the environment because it can become very contentious. Because the actual impact, some people are going to say, well, I'm really just concerned about things that are going on locally. And some people say, well, I want to think about how this is going to affect people that we'll never even meet. And so they can get into conversations about what kind of people are more important. When I'm working with these, that's what I'm hearing, and I'm listening for these conflict between generations. So the generation before them wanted to know, what does the data show? The boomer generation before them, they wanted to know what's right. This particular generation says, what's the best of all the choices we have? Can you help me understand what the best choice is? They want to see the differences in them, and then they want to know from you what the best choice is. And that might be that best. It might be because it will have different levels of impact. They may be more willing to do things like conserve a gallon of water here because that's the best way that they can ensure that aquifer hundreds of miles away will be full. So they understand this, and that's the way that they're communicating is what's our best choice. So when they're going to make a decision, a lot of times they're going to ask you, well, I want to do something, but I want to do whatever the best choice might be. And so having some information about that, the different choices that are available, and here's what we think is best right now with the science that we have, can be a way to connect to them. It can also be a way that we communicate that we have lots of good choices. And right now, today, this year, this month, this week, this is what might be most needed. What's the best choice? So millennials, they seek this meaningful, purpose-driven work, which I really connect with, about having to describe how the work you do in conservation or stewardship matters. So we have people who before were practical, people who before wanted to do the right things. This generation wants to find purpose. And so having a way to describe what you're doing with that gives purpose is can be important. They value sustainability and innovative practices. So when we're talking to this particular generation, I'm finding that they might be more willing to take on some new practices because they have a different view of innovation. But I have to really describe it in that way. So I frame discussions a lot of times with this particular generation in the long term, the long game, the long view, and a lot of collaboration. So when I have workshops, some generations want information and data. This generation particularly, I might work with them and try to weave in a little bit of collaboration, maybe ways for groups to work together to figure out, okay, if we were to approach this problem or we were to design a program, I don't come to them with all the answers. I want to have them spend a little bit of time collaborating, maybe around tables. If you're leading or working with groups and you think, okay, I can actually put them together and say, would you guys mind collaborating on this and coming back with some ways you think that this should be designed? So I try to engage them more in collaboration styles and co-creation, including digital tools. So a lot of people say, well, this generation, they don't want to put down their phones. For me, and a lot of times that's okay, because one thing that they're doing is they're capturing and sharing stewardship and sustainability, and they're sharing that in ways that I'm a Generation Xer, I'm not as native to, and so I'm trying to engage that piece of that with them. So the last generation that we know something about right now is that this is not our last generation alive. This is one that's going and completing their cycle of what was tragic, COVID. They have a lot of influences toward that, and they have a lot of great wins. They saw a lot of good things happening, including our first Black president. So they got to see a lot of wins as well. This generation is very interested. The other generation was what's best. This one wants to know what's good. They actually have an intrinsic need toward, okay, what's going to make the most good, which is a great environmental piece for moving forward. When I work with this generation who is approaching, these are all approaching their 30s, anywhere in between that area, that little bit of the born after usually 2012. I'm sorry, born before 2012. They're all approaching adulthood in this piece. They're voters. This is ones that are highly moving into our workforce. But when they talk to me, they ask about what could they do that might be the most good for everybody. And so on the environmental side, they do a lot of things that they perceive as helpful. So a little bit more of an empathetic generation. Empathy tends to be very high in this generation. They also want to do what's most helpful for the most people. So it's a very wide lens of what good means. That means some equity. That means who's being left out. They might ask questions like that, and they might have some really good information on how to bring new people to the table that haven't particularly been invested before. And so they make a great team member for actually helping think about what will be the most helpful if you have a program. And a lot of times I lean on them to bring that to the table to help in the design process of what should we be doing to help be a little bit more helpful in some of the programs that we have. They are very technology adept and socially conscious, and they view their role as part of a larger movement. And they tend to have a leaning right now, we're finding, toward things like regenerative practices because they're mentally calculating, yep, this is something that might be doing them be the most helpful. They're really great at integrating, obviously, the latest technology and social media strategies, and I often lean on them as advisors for best practices. I didn't teach myself how to use AI; they're teaching me. They use platforms that resonate with their digital first mindset, and that includes using them judiciously as well. And they have a really great sense on how to do hands-on learning that's integrated and hybrid. So really appreciate that part of what they're bringing to the table. The generation that's coming up, we'll just kind of finish up with them because we're running out of time here. And we want to finish on this generation. This is the generation that's right now being born, and this is the last. 2025 was the year that they would have been born. 26 will probably be moving into the next generation. We're thinking about the fact that they're going to want very responsive programming, everything, a way to interact both in person, in place, offline, online. Unfortunately, we are thinking that their greatest tragedy is going to be an environmental issue, and we are starting to see that possibility really arise. It's too early to know what will be the motivation that will influence them the most. However, we are definitely seeing echoes of everything, which will very much change how we do programming, and the expectation of that you have to show up to be important. You can show up in many different ways, and automation is going to be something that they're going to be interested in. So I think one thing that we could do to kind of get us to this last part, I want to leave a few minutes here for some question and answers, is you kind of get an idea that different strengths are really prevalent in different generations. And if I were to ask you, if we were in a room, I would want to know, what do you think that the best strength for you and your generation particularly can be there to help people connect with nature? How can we maximize the strength in generations? And the best way to know that is to actually ask someone in that generation, what do you think is your great strength to help people connect with nature? Is it storytelling? Is it, in my case, I love to create data on nature. I love to create maps. I love to create bar graphs, which sounds really geeky and weird unless you're actually in that generation. But I think I can help my generation my generation can bring data to bear that really explains complex environmental situations. So that's the thing that I think, gosh, if I had a way to make a contribution in my generation, that's what I would feel really comfortable in. So go ahead and type in your generation if you can, and what strength you think you as a generational person could bring to help people connect with nature. What would be some of your ideas? So I'm going to leave this up just as our last one as we go into that. And just because I want to show you just the differences about our original question, which was, is there really that much difference potentially in how people or different generations self-view themselves and may have an impact? And I'm just going to leave this up here just to see what you think. And this is what we're seeing about how people answer the question or what they see might be important for them in their environmental framing. So Michelle and Hannah, I'm going to go ahead and I guess make my screen smaller at this point and go back to the webinar and see what we got going on for the last. It's 12:56. So you tell me what you want to. What's next?
Well, there's stuff rolling in the chat. We've never seen the chat so active in any of our webinars before. So great job on engaging people there. My question, you talked a lot about how to engage each individual group, but so many of our chapters and the programs and projects that we offer through the Master Naturalist program involve many of these generations all together.
Yes.
So what's if you had to pick, what's maybe one tip or technique that you have that kind of spans all those generations?
So what I tend to do is think about, and most of my programming, I still traditionally think, okay, when we get together, and that may be online or offline, we actually have a little bit of it here, is we're creating engagement through hybridizing some questions here. We're creating some engagement. Other particular generations, that question I just asked was about co-creation of something. So one of the things that I do if I have is I have stopped creating any type of thing I get together. I'm just going to say I like a live programming with an agenda that runs by the hour. I try to create a hybrid event where maybe I have some networking in the beginning. I have people who they sit down and the first thing they do is sit down and talk to each other. Some generations hate that. Great, go get coffee if you hate it. Other generations love it. They want the chance to actually talk to somebody. I start the program and I might say, instead of me starting the program as I'm not the expert in the room, I might start the program and say, okay, today our biggest challenge is designing, let's say I'm working on designing a field trip. We want to design a field trip that's going to have people explore soil health. How would we do that? And I'm going to start it by co-creating versus getting up there. My traditional way I've been trained is be the expert in the room and tell people what they need to know. But so I modify so that I try to incorporate as many elements as I can, whether it's a training, whether I'm out in the field. Hey, would some of you take pictures while we're here and post it? Make sure to tag us so we know. If I'm online, I'm like, let's think about this together. Let's have some networking time before we get into the lecturing time, which is what I love. I want to hear all the expert data, but I'm going to pause and give some time for other generations to have a moment of time that they might enjoy. So maybe I didn't answer that, but I try to do a lot.
No, I mean, the answer is try to incorporate what I heard you say. The answer was to try and incorporate a little bit of something for everyone across the generations in those situations.
Yes, try it. I'd say try it and look for triggers. You'll find out. You don't even have to ask the people, what generation are you? Try some different things that trigger their ability to engage.
I'm trying to find any other questions in the chat. And like I said, this chat has been very active today. So lots of comments, lots of feedback and engagement there. I'm just really having a hard time finding any additional questions, like a real question for you. So
to be honest,
if
most
the
of the
team has
conversation,
anything they take. Go ahead.
I think most of the conversation in the chat is it's the conversation. There aren't very many questions, and the one that I did see, you basically just answered. How do we, on these events where we're interacting with multiple generations, tailor to multiple generations. And so you've already answered that, but a
Yes.
lot of accolades in the chat. Everyone really loved the presentation.
Well, I think I just love the work. I mean, the Master Naturalist as a whole is truly actually doing a lot of the generational, they're breaking the mold for that. And I really applaud that because I've been to a lot of the different events and people are really thinking. I think one thing is try, if you have your own, is be empathetic to other generations, learn their triggers, learn what motivates them, and just try to have a conversation where you step out of your generational love and kind of just think about what other people, what would motivate them. Because I believe that for environmental problem solving, the team thinking is probably the best. Learn how to design everything you do that has a small trigger for each generation.
There is one question that's kind of been reiterated here towards the end of the chat, Amy, and it's moving up. So I'm going to paraphrase what I remember seeing. So within the generations, are there any differences between or with race?
Races and rural, suburban, urban environments
Yeah,
were the two.
that's a great question. So the other influences that we look at, and that is a great question. We used to have a lot of more difference between rural and urban. That difference has in the last two generations changed. We're finding that even like let's say knowledge or contact with nature used to be pretty different between urban and rural. That is no longer the we're finding that our rural youth, our rural young adults have had as little contact with nature as our urban ones. That seems to be playing out, unfortunately, and it really is lined up with, I think we all know that the number of people who actually farm and ranch is now less than 2%. So whether you grow up in an urban and rural environment is no longer really dictating whether or not you know about natural systems, whether you've had contact with the environment. What we're finding in both rural and urban is that you absolutely probably have to make conscious efforts for people to be in contact and understand environment, and environmental principles, pretty high rate. Whether or not different cultures, absolutely. We do find a lot of cultural emphasis, and it also is between race and creed, right? So we have people who grow up in tribes. We have people that are now more international, coming from different places, and they have international culture, not just regionally differences in the United States about that. So there's some definitely an increase in the amount of different types of cultural. On the flip side of that, where we used to see generations were very similar in the United States and internationally, those generations were different than we would have had. We're seeing the flip of that now is that generation, let's say Gen Alpha, they actually have more similarity to international Gen Alpha than we ever saw before. And that's coming to play with the environmental issues specifically, as well as some other things like human rights, where internationally we used to have very different views on that, but these new generations actually share more environmental commonality than they have in the past.
Okay, Amy, I can't thank you. I think we can't thank you enough for the great information that you've provided to our larger audience here today. At one time I checked, we had more than 450 people
Oh
online, so
gosh.
I'm pretty sure more people joined us as we got started too. So, and then even more will be able to view the recording later on. So thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. And I'll
Hannah,
be
do you have
reading, I know we
any?
get the chat, I'll look through the chat stuff. We're going to, I know people have already left, but we're going to AI the heck out of that thing, and we're going to figure out and kind of aggregate what people were saying, because there's just so much valuable information that you've shared today. So thank you also for participating as a group and being willing to kind of do this hybrid one. Really appreciated that.
Anyone who in the chat asked for the slides that I haven't responded to within the chat, they will be on our TMN Tuesday page along with the recording either later this afternoon or by tomorrow morning. So just keep an eye out for that.
And thanks for joining us today.
All right. Y'all have a great day. Thank you so much.